This story sounds familiar. You were at church this Sunday or a Sunday and you heard that the pastor had an affair with another woman and therefore he has been removed from his position and is probably not going to pastor ever again. Odds are you've probably heard something at least similar to that if you've never personally experienced yourself. Well, I want us to take a step back for a second and I want to answer a question that one of you guys asked me, and it broke my heart when I was asked the question. I want to read through this conversation that was had with me privately by a gentleman who is wrestling in his faith, and he had some genuine raw questions but was too scared to go to somebody in leadership in his church about this question. Now, first thing that I want to say is the fact that somebody would be too scared to go to somebody in leadership shows that us as the church at large do not have as much of a care to bring somebody back into restoration as we do to condemn somebody. Listen to what I just said. Us in the church, by and large today, have more of an interest to condemn somebody rather than to restore them back into the fold in just a super gracious way. Why is that? Well, generally speaking, we say something like, well, we can't have this person be an example as to how the congregation is supposed to act. I'll come back to that statement here in a minute. I'm going to wrap back around that, but I want to read this conversation that I'd had with this gentleman. He started the conversation off saying, hey, I'm struggling with pornography. I keep falling into pornography, and I was curious how you can help me. And I just wanted to ask him a few questions before I could give him an answer. I wanted to know how old he was, what he's watching it on, all of these things. Figured out that he was pretty young. He just became an adult a little while ago. He is watching it on his phone, and one of the first things that he'd said was, I encouraged him to get rid of his phone, and his response to me was, I really have thought about doing that because the blockers thing, like there's always a way around it. But he said, the issue is I'd have to tell my dad then. Again, another point, I don't know if this person's dad is saved, so I can't speak to a non-believer, but to a believer I can say, if you're a believer as a dad and you're listening to this video right now, listen to my words. Yes, I'm also a father, to be clear. About to be a father of two, which is really exciting. But your son or your daughter, you want to come to you when they're wrestling and struggling and fighting with something. They are going to go to the world for a solution if the world is more gracious than the church is. Now, what I did not just say is that you as a parent should just let everything go and just be like, oh, it's okay, grace has got it, and then don't consider what happened. Obviously, take seriously what happened. But what you ought not to do is to make them feel so shamed, guilted, and condemned every single time they do anything that's not biblical that they feel like they cannot any longer come to you. It's really important, because if not, you're going to be in a scenario like this where this person is not going to go to his dad with this, giving up his phone, because his dad's going to start poking, prodding questions, figure out, and probably freak out. And then he said after that, this is the part I really want to get to. He said, for some weird reasons, blockers don't work on my phone. He said, how do I deal with attraction to the same sex? This is such a passionate topic of mine, and it breaks my heart to see how people oftentimes have to deal with this struggle alone. I said, being attracted to the same sex isn't where you sinned. Giving into the temptation is where you have sinned. You having the temptation to want to be with somebody of the same gender is not a sin. Temptation in general is not a sin. How do I know that? Well, let's go to Matthew 4, where it says that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted. Go into Hebrews, where it says that Jesus was tempted at all points, yet without sin. Temptation is not a sin. Temptation is you being given the invitation that you can do something that you know you're not supposed to do. Sin is when you give in to that temptation and actually act upon whatever it is that you were being tempted with in the first place. Having the attraction to the same gender is not a sin, in the same way that me being attracted to the opposite gender is not a sin. And people's response is, no, well, Cody, you're supposed to be attracted to the opposite gender. Yes and no. I am supposed to be attracted to the opposite gender. I'm not supposed to be attracted to every single woman I see. That's called lust. I have an attraction for my wife, right? And I have a desire for being with my wife. But just like a homosexual person can choose to not act upon his desire to sleep with every woman, so can a heterosexual choose not to choose not to give into the temptation to sleep with every person of the opposite gender. So temptation is not a sin. Having a wrestle with attraction to the same sex is not a sin either. In the same way that you have the desire to lie and to steal and to murder and to lust and to hate in your heart and to get angry, in a non-biblical way, all of these things you have the desire to do as well, and those things are not counted to you as sin just because your nature has an aspiration to do those things. What is sin is when you give in to those desires. God knows that in my desire, it would be more convenient if I could steal money from a bank, because then I would have more money than I have today. But he also knows that my desire is to do the will of my Father. And just like in this person's life right here, their desire is to do the will of the Father. And I know that because they're asking how to be free from this thing. So let's be careful with how we criticize people for this homosexuality thing. I said giving in is a huge difference from you just having a temptation. And this person's response was, I feel very relieved to hear that. One more question. So I've been a part of leadership in a Christian small group where we talk about plenty of different topics. Sometimes it's my turn to talk. Should I give up my leadership position? And listen to this banter back and forth I have with him. I'm kind of playing with him, but I'm being serious at the same time. I said, just curious, why would you give up your position? He said, because I'm struggling with sexual sin. And I said, just curious, have you ever wrestled with committing any other sin that's not sexual ever in your life? And he said, yes, with a laughing emoji. I said, sounds like you can never be in leadership then, bro. And he sent laughing emojis back, and he was in tears, telling me that he's in tears by how relieving our conversation was, and that he's never experienced this kind of grace in his life before. Guys, that's heartbreaking. I want to expound upon my conversation that I just had with him there at the end. We have this belief system that because somebody like him has a struggle with pornography or a struggle with same-sex attraction or anger or pride. Here's one contrast I want to make that I find really ironic. Why is it that sexual sin is always considered to be much more of a serious sin than something like pride in regards to making somebody be removed from leadership? When we look at scriptures in the Bible in regards to what serious concerns there are with sins, we see, scripturally speaking, that pride coming before the fall of somebody is way more of a serious concern for somebody's salvation than somebody having a sexual immorality problem. When we look at 1 Corinthians 5, and this actually has to do with pride and sexual immorality at the same time, but it talks about how he was sexually immoral, this man was sexually immoral with a stepmother, and it says that I have handed this man over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh so that he may be saved on the day of judgment, because he is not only committing this sin, but he is arrogant in the sin that he's committed. He's proud that he slept with his stepmom. He's bragging to his friends that he slept with his stepmom. Does that scenario right there and that pride that this man has, because remember, Paul handed him over to Satan in 1 Corinthians 5 as removing him as part of the body due to the fact of his pride in his sin. It wasn't the sin that made him hand him over. It was the pride of his sin that got him handed over to Satan. That's what made Paul said, you are no longer part of the brethren anymore. Does that scenario right there sound like this scenario with this man that I'm speaking with over Messenger? Not even close. Does he sound like he's proud about his sin? Is he being arrogant and boastful about the amount of porn that he's watched or how many dudes he's checked out? No, he's broken. He's devastated over this, and he doesn't feel like there's any hope left. At that point is when we give somebody hope. That person's the one who needs hope. This person's going to be knocked off their high horse, just like Saul was. But this man over here that I'm talking to, he needs nothing but grace, compassion, and mercy. What are you training the brain of somebody when they fall into a sin that your first response is you lose all Christian responsibility and intentionality that you had into pouring into other people's lives? It's clearly implying, that if you are not a perfect human being, you are not a Christian. And you can't be in leadership. You either are perfect or get off of leadership. So then it gives us this fake persona that everybody who's in leadership is perfect. So that when your pastor from earlier comes up on this Sunday and admits that he has been sleeping around with another woman, the secretary, or whatever else, the church is entirely devastated because they feel completely lied to, because this man who so acted perfect all of this time is now acknowledging not only his first sin to you, but is a pretty intense sin as well. It's a really big deal for us to, as a church, not make somebody step down because they did something bad today. You're teaching everybody that you're discipling and who's under you that the only form of Christianity that's well worth living in is a perfect one, which is impossible, which is called being fake. You're training people to be fake and have a legalistic mindset where they believe that if they can just do enough, and if they do enough right, then God's pleased with them, because the church leadership is teaching them that if they are not perfect, then they are going to be removed, they are going to be shunned, they are going to be shamed, they are going to be gossiped about. Have you sinned in the past week? How would you like if everybody at your church, whether you're in leadership or not, just spent all of their time gossiping about you and talking about how they're going to kick you out of your position because you got angry at somebody the other day? Or because you were short-tempered with your wife the other day? Who gets to be in leadership then? This kind of thing paints a really concerning picture in the church of what being a Pharisee today looks like. These Pharisees were people who acted like they had it all together, acted like they were perfect. They went twice across the world to find themselves a proselyte they went half across the world to find themselves a proselyte just to make them twice the son of hell as they were themselves. They neglect the weightier portions of the law, faith, justice, and mercy, so that they can brag to people about tithing their mint, dill, and cumin. These people are so focused on having the persona of perfection, the persona of righteousness, that they're not living righteously at all. They're actually not doing anything that Jesus called them to do. They're tithing mint, dill, and cumin, which is not even mentioned in the Old Testament a single time to do. There's nowhere in the entire Bible that you can find tithing mint, dill, and cumin. Now I'm not saying that they're sinning for doing it. I'm just saying they're tithing mint, dill, and cumin. They're doing all of these things that we see in, it's Matthew 8 or 11, somewhere 14 maybe. It's somewhere around that area. Where in Matthew there, it's talking about how these people were keeping the traditions of man but neglecting the laws of God. This is what Jesus is talking to and the Pharisees, and when they're keeping the tradition of washing hands and they're condemning the disciples for not washing hands. And he says, dude, you guys are keeping your traditions over top of the law of God. You're doing traditions, but you're not even doing what Jesus has even asked you to do. This whole Pharisee kind of mindset of looking perfect to the crowds and making sure that you've got all your ducks in a row with your own self-righteous rules that you've made, like wash your hands before you eat, is making other people feel condemned while you're looking like you're the king up here, yet you're not the king. You're just as much of a sinner as the person who you're looking down upon. They're just committing a different sin than you, so you feel the need or the opportunity to be able to bash them for it. In Jude 1, it says, we revile the things in which we don't understand. It's very easy for me to mock you and ridicule you and your drug addiction, because I've never touched drug or alcohol in my entire life. I could rip into people all day and have my big old proud air. Oh, I'm glad I've never done anything like that. Talk about sexual immorality, though. Fell in real hard into that for like a decade of my life. Not going to be so haughty and proud about my ripping into people who struggle with that. I think I'll be a lot more compassionate about that because I know what it's like. But why is it that we can't be like that in all sins? Why is it that even though I'm not gay and I've never struggled with homosexuality in my life, why can't I have compassion on him? Like this weird theology in the church, again, this is a tradition in the church today, where we say, oh, he struggled with drugs, let's get one of the ex-drug addicts over there to talk to him. And I have no problem with that, and I'm sure that they can have, some specific lingo that they can talk back and forth with and banter in that's probably, going to be more clear than somebody who's not struggled with drugs. But I don't need to have had struggle with drugs to minister to a drug addict. Matter of fact, I've seen dozens of people who struggle with drugs completely free, and I've never touched a drug in my life. It's got nothing to do with being able to relate to what they're going through. I can relate to Jesus and Christ in me and what Christ has called me to, and all I need to do is talk to that person on the other side with grace and mercy and share the truth in love with them, like it says in Ephesians 4. Like, if I can just share the truth in love with them, then they're going to be able to be set free because they will know the truth and the truth will set them free. If I can just know truth, they can be set free, period. It doesn't matter whether I can you relate to drug addiction or relate to human trafficking to be able to talk to somebody who's in human trafficking. No. I can relate to Jesus because he's in me, he lives through me, and I can speak to that person simply because I'm a believer and I know the words of truth that are found in this Bible. That's all I need. And when somebody's falling into sin, when somebody's struggling and wrestling, I want to keep them in a place of leadership. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's no time when somebody should not be leading. Like, again, if somebody's not even a believer and they're just doing it for whatever reason, I'm not saying that there's no times when somebody should step down from leadership or even to be able to get their head off of a space of being consistently busy so that they can, take a step back and focus intentionally on their walk with Christ. I'm not saying any of those things can't happen. I'm not saying that they're not allowed to happen. But this idea of we just shoot somebody down and remove them from leadership who are doing great spiritually but had a mistake that they should have never made is a horrible thing to do to somebody. I'd rather keep them up there so that the people getting discipled and learning from them could see, wow, he's imperfect, he messed up, but he's still saved by grace. Maybe there's hope for me too. That gives me so much more encouragement than the guy who's perfect and has never sinned before, because I can't relate to him because I have failed. I have sinned before. I failed this week. So therefore, it's impossible for me to relate to that guy at all. But the guy who was saved by grace, who failed and was still saved by grace, I can relate to him a whole lot. And that's a really encouraging story to me. I want to share one last story and then I'll stop. I had a gentleman actually from my work, and he called. He wanted to start a business, and he called me. And we're just talking on the phone. And in the midst of our conversation, I mentioned something about being a believer. On my work calls, a lot of times we'll talk about Jesus because I'm supposed to be a Christian at my job, just like I'm supposed to be a Christian off my job. And I mentioned something about Jesus, and this person was like, wow, that was pretty bold of you to say about Jesus. I forget what he said, but and I said, yeah, man, Jesus is everything to me. Like, for what profit is it if a man gains the whole world yet loses his soul? Like, money is nothing. If you're just fighting in this thing for the rat race of money, then you're a goner. And he said, yeah, man. He's like, I totally get that. He's like, but times are super hard for me right now. He's like, actually, you probably kind of think this is cool, but I used to be a worship leader. I was like, awesome, dude. That's super cool. And then he just starts to break down all this stuff for me that he's been going through. And he used to be a worship leader, but he stepped down from his position because he ended up getting a girl pregnant while he was worship leader. And it sounds like he was a really, really solid believer. And he had one night that he did something that he regretted. He is not with that woman anymore, even still has the kid, but just made one mistake, and he was kicked out of it was a paid staff position as well. And he was kicked out of his position, and from that point on, turned from the Lord. The church turned on him. Jesus turned on him. So he feels, because again, obviously Jesus didn't actually turn on him, to be clear. But in his mind, Jesus has turned on him. Everybody in the church, the people who are supposed to be the most loving, gracious, unified body of people on the planet, have turned from you. And what does he do? He turns to the only people who will actually love him and care for him. Turns to drugs. Starts doing drugs. He gets down this big old path. I know he's not like shooting up heroin or anything, but he's doing drugs. And he gets on the phone with me, and he's like, man, I'm just so stuck in this smoking weed every single day, and I'm literally smoking my life away. All because of this, big old tumble that happened, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was. And he's like, dude, I'm just sick of living in this place. And I was like, you didn't ask me for advice, but you kind of did because you just said all that, and you want help. No one says all that stuff to a total random stranger they've never met online if they don't want help. You want help. I said, I'm not going to ask you to stop smoking weed. And hear what I'm about to say here. I said, I'm not going to ask you to stop smoking weed. So I'm going to ask you to do one thing. Every time before you smoke, just say, Jesus, I thank you so much that you love me. I just want to thank you for loving me. So then if you still want to smoke, keep smoking. And it got silent on the other side of the phone. And he starts to bawl. I mean, lose it. Hysterically, struggling to breathe, lose it. I mean, bawling his eyes out. And he gave his life back to Jesus that day. And it's about maybe a month and a half ago now. And he gave his life to Jesus that day. It was like, dude, I'm done living this lifestyle. I'm ready to come back to the Lord. It was so sweet. My point in sharing that is to say, he was completely kicked off of church staff and felt like he should no longer have the opportunity to be a believer at the sake of the next 5 years of his life. And what happens if there's not a Cody or a whoever it is on the other side of the screen listening right now that's there to speak to them? He'll die and go to hell one day because he just ran from the Lord his whole life. Because he was taught that that's what was right by the church. Because we need to be gracious and compassionate and merciful. The whole golden rule, do unto others as you want done unto you. You would not like for everybody to shame you, condemn you, and publicly humiliate you for your sin just because you failed in whatever you failed in. Because you failed this week, like everybody else did. But instead, if you can keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith, and have a body of believers who are stirring you up in love and good works, and to keeping your eyes fixed on Jesus in the midst of your sin, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free.